You guys could join. So thank you so much for joining. My name is Michelle Savilich. I, along with my colleague Colin Parkman, have decided to start a nonprofit for all of us to join called CIRCA, the Center for Integrative Research in Conflict Archaeology. So for those of you, this is your first time joining us, we've been doing these monthly lectures on the last Wednesday of the month for people to just kind of get to know who our research fellows are right now. We have a slate of 6 research fellows. We're working on what I think might be the very first conflict archaeology, honest to goodness textbook for undergrads and upper undergrads. So we're really excited about that. So again, CIRCA, we're just trying to create a space for all of us in between the Fields of Conflict conferences that happen every other year. It gets kind of lonely when we all go back to our corners of our world. We're kind of a very niche specialty, so usually there's not a lot of us in any one area. So I thought it would be nice to have an online space, especially since as the founders of the field are slowly retiring, programs are disappearing, as undergrads are entering college and might want to join the field of conflict archaeology, they are left to themselves to figure out how to navigate the system and how to get trained. So I want CIRCA to be the first place that kids can go to figure out, I want to major in conflict archaeology. I want to study conflict archaeology. What do I do? How do I get there? Or just, I have questions about it. So I'm really hoping we can just be a research hub for people to connect people and resources and help people navigate this unusual career field. Just a reminder, our next talk is going to be April 29th. We have Helen Basson, who will be talking on landscape as the last living witness to the Battle of the Somme. It's going to be a fascinating talk about some overlooked aspects of conflict archaeology, namely the landscape that it happens. But today I wanted to introduce you to Dr. Jo Ball. She's an archaeologist based in Northwest England, specializing in the archaeology of the warfare of the ancient classical world. She is currently a lecturer in ancient history at the Manchester Metropolitan University and a university teacher at the University of Liverpool. She graduated with a PhD in archaeology from the University of Liverpool and explored the site formation processes on ancient Greek and Roman open field battle sites. And she's worked on several around Europe and Germany, and she's got a whole bunch of publications. So I really encourage you to check out her bio on the website, conflictarchaeology.org, and learn more about her. And I will turn it over to Dr. Ball. I am going to go ahead and mute myself and turn off my camera because I am traveling and there are feral chickens outside, and I guarantee some feral children of mine will be running through here. But at the end of the talk, we can turn our cameras and microphones back on and have a nice question and answer. So to you.
Great. Let's see if I can manage to share a screen twice in one day. So, let's see. And is that full? Can people see that full?
Yes,
Perfect. Great. Then we will get going with this talk. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in for this, and thank you also to everybody who is watching this after the fact. Thanks also hugely to Michelle for everything she's done for CIRCA. It's been revelatory to have a conflict archaeology community that we can be part of, and I really hope it carries on for generations afterwards, as you know, as envisioned ideally when it was set up. And Michelle does amazing stuff looking after families, chickens, all sorts of things. So it's fantastic that she's had the time to do this as well. So what I want to talk to you about today is a more temporally dislocated, I suppose, aspect of conflict archaeology, which is its application to the classical ancient world, more specifically to ancient Roman warfare. It's a period that isn't always associated with some of these newer theoretical approaches to conflict and to archaeology. And so over the last sort of decade or so, I have been demonstrating how this methodology can be applied to the ancient world, and also trying to convince people working in the sphere of ancient conflict just what archaeology can kind of bring to our discipline. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is ultimately, is it a conflict artifact or not? I'm going to be talking about the remains of the battle dead from Roman warfare. So obviously in this, there are going to be lots of pictures of human remains. So if that isn't your thing, then, you know, try not to look at the screen, and try not to have nightmares about it if you do. And what I want to look at is what happened to the bodies of the battle dead in Roman warfare, and what we find on battle sites, and sort of reconciling those two, as we'll see, quite different aspects. So today we're very familiar with the site of military cemeteries, of the rows and rows of identical tombstones that mark the graves of the fallen from specific wars or sometimes specific countries. These concepts of these bands of brothers who fought together, died together, and then lie together in eternity. Many of these sites lie on what is foreign soil from the perspective of the casualties. So some more recent ones relate to as well to casualties who have been repatriated. Through most of history, though, it hasn't been possible to bring the dead home from conflicts that they fell in, particularly those that were overseas. But even when it was national conflict or anything beyond sort of very localized conflict, it became routine that the dead would not be brought home for burial, but would be left in kind of communal or group burials close to the sites and the battlefields on which they've fallen. It's only really in the 20th century, and particularly the latter half of it, that we start to see the dead not lying on or near the battlefields on which they had fallen. So many of the burials that are done on battlefields are done by necessity, very quickly, very efficiently, either digging shallow individual graves, or more often graves in which two or more individuals are going to go into, and there can be multiple soldiers in each grave cut. And you might find examples of kind of single graves and multiple graves being used on the same sites, depending on sort of concentrations of dead in different areas or the time that is available to bury these individuals. So these examples from the 19th century United States kind of conflict, but you get the idea of this is pretty much what we're seeing throughout the rest of history. And unless these graves are deliberately exhumed later to facilitate either a reburial in a more formalized conflict cemetery or something, so as things that happen with sort of the American Civil War or the First World War and indeed the Second World War, the remains of the battle dead pretty much then lie on the battlefields on which they were buried until they're either disturbed by agricultural activity, commercial development, treasure seekers, or indeed by us coming and doing archaeological research. So the remains of the battle dead have been found on a number of battle sites. There are also quite a few where it's known where the dead are, but efforts have been made deliberately not to disturb them. So on sites like Culloden in Scotland. So, but in some battlefields, we do have evidence of the battle dead. But human remains have been found on probable conflict sites dating right back to the Bronze Age and probably even further back. So this is consistent with that the dead are typically buried on the battle sites on which they fell, and that this being a consistent practice through most of history. So therefore, we should expect that for every battlefield, particularly those that lie away from kind of urban centers or other human settlements, that we would find a grave, that there would be some kind of grave feature containing the human remains of those that died on the site, and probably two, one for the victorious army, one and probably bigger one for the defeated army. But anything other than the physical environment being hostile to the survival of these remains, or sort of known land activity precluding that, otherwise we should find human remains on every site. But the reality is much more complicated than that, and certainly it is when we look at the Roman period. So for the rest of this talk, we're going to look into the historical and archaeological evidence for what happened to the Roman battle dead. So looking at the theory, what the sources tell us what happened, then looking at what we actually find on battle sites, and comparing these two kind of the theory and the reality, and to explore why there is, spoiler alert, a bit of a discrepancy between them. So the practice of leaving the battle dead on the battlefields on which they died is well established by the classical Greek period. It's the practice that we see happening in, this period that precedes ancient Rome. Almost every Greek city leaves its battle dead on the site on which they fell. They describe this often as being on-the-spot burials. The only exception is supposedly the city-state of Athens during the latter part of the 5th century BC, who ostensibly cremate their battle dead on the site and then repatriate those cremated remains back for a public funeral in Athens. But there are some recent studies into the feasibility of this that suggest that maybe what they do is actually they cremate a symbolic small number of individuals and take their remains home, and everybody else stays in a mass grave on the site, consistent with every other Greek city. So we see them being buried in underneath grave mounds, which you can see on the slide on the left-hand side of the slide, which is the grave mound at the battlefield of Marathon, which allegedly contains the remains of 192 Athenian soldiers who died in the Battle of Marathon against the Persians in 490 BC. To the right of that, the layout is from a battlefield grave at the site of Chaeronea, dating to the Greek battle between the Thebans and Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father. And we can see all of these individuals laid out in a mass grave. So this is one single grave context. They're there. They've largely been stripped of most of their remains, but quite a few of the individuals have sort of embedded projectiles and stuff that went into the grave with them. And again, they're buried on the battle site. So we have a background in the ancient world of that the dead are left on the battlefield, sometimes inhumed, sometimes cremated. So this is the context into which Roman practices enter and develop. So in theory, we know what happened to the Roman battle dead. We are told by not as many sources as you would think, but we are told by some sources that the Roman battle dead, just like their counterparts in other period of history, are buried or cremated en masse on the battlefield, and that is where they are left. They are not taken home unless they are a particular elite individual who's sort of having this taken back by family or state influence and at their expense as well. So Roman sources, though, are actually, when you look into them, they're pretty reticent about what happens to the battle dead in most narratives of ancient battles. They rarely give any description of what happens to the dead after any individual battle. They're probably expecting that their readership, which will mostly be elite males who are involved in kind of the social, political, military life of Rome already, that they will know what those processes are. And Roman writers, they don't tend to waste time telling you something that you already know. Unfortunately, from our perspective, it is something we don't know, but they weren't writing for us. More's the pity. So where the burial practices are mentioned by ancient sources, it's always questionable whether these practices are reflecting the common practice, in which case, why are they mentioning it? Or whether these examples that they mention are actually aberrations in the practices. And so maybe we shouldn't base our understanding of Roman burial practices on these descriptions. And again, we'll come on to that later in the context of what we actually find on sites. But so what can we say based on the historical record about what the Romans do with their battle dead? Well, we're told by one source that it's not just custom and practice that the battle dead are left on the battlefield, that it's actually a political decision that was made at the highest level during the Roman Republican period to deliberately not bring the dead back for burial. The reason for this is provided in one source who says that when the battle dead are brought home and they're paraded through the city and funerals take place and there's public mourning, that it puts other people off joining the army, because it makes them realize the scale of loss and the danger of doing so, and that it impacts morale and makes soldiers, potential soldiers, less likely to enlist. So it's a very practical reason that is given by this source for why the Roman battle dead are left on the battlefield, that it is this practical reason of avoiding putting people off. And this leads into kind of generic assessments by historians in the kind of 19th and 20th century that leads to sweeping statements of such that Roman soldiers killed on the battlefield were collectively cremated or buried. Stated as fact, no questioning on whether this is accurate or not, no allowance for that there may be discrepancies within this, but as we'll see, there are some issues with such a sweeping statement about their treatment. So the methods that are used to bury the battle dead on the battlefield do seem to have varied between different circumstances or indeed over time. We do get references to both mass inhumation and mass cremation in the Roman sources. So this quote from Livy, in the Roman Republican period, we see that the bodies of the battle dead are collected together into a heap and then cremated on the battlefield. But from a later battle in exactly the same conflict, we have the bodies of the battle dead being collected together and then buried in one common grave. So there's probably at this stage no customary practice. It's up to the individual circumstances. If you can cremate the dead, do that. If it's better to just inhume them, then do that. Again, we see other references to common burial places, so inhumation burials. This is from a slightly later conflict, but talking about one individual being given a special individual burial near the common grave of everybody else that's died in the battle. In theory, we should see a move towards cremation in the disposal of the Roman battle dead. We see another source who says that cremation is introduced to the treatment of the Roman battle dead after they start campaigning outside of Italy and outside of areas that they then territorially control straight afterwards. Cremation is introduced because they discover that once they bury their battle dead and they leave the battle site, that the enemy are coming, that they're digging up their battle dead and they're despoiling the bodies and then scattering them. So we're told that cremation is brought in because the bodies are being subjected to this humiliating and nasty treatment, and so they go with cremation instead. So we should, in theory, start to see a move towards cremation rather than inhumation in the disposal of the dead. Generally, the graves are not supposed to be marked in any way. This ties in partly with, again, making them not subject to being despoiled. So making sure that they are unobtrusive, I suppose, in the landscape and not drawing attention to where these battle dead have been left. So generally, Roman battle sites are not marked really by any permanent memorials. They tend to follow the Greek practice of, if you're going to put up a memorial, it should be a temporary one. The favored method is can be seen on this slide to the left, but this is a carved marble version. But you find a tree stump and you dress it up in some of the enemy's captured arms and armor. So you put a breastplate on it, you put a helmet on the top, you pile then shields and swords and other weapons around it, and that is your monument. It is temporary in its nature. It degrades pretty quickly. The material gets removed. So there's not these permanent memorials being put on these sites, and certainly not to mark the burials of the battle dead. Again, linked into the cremation idea, we do find in one instance when a funeral mound is put over a burial of the Roman battle dead, that as soon as the Romans leave the field, the mound is torn down by their enemies. So, there's no huge point in doing so. So we see this is not a practice that the Romans particularly follow in terms of actually marking. Certainly no individual tombstones for soldiers, or even a mass casualty list that sort of gives the name of everybody that is buried there. But remember that they don't do this for later. So in terms of what we see, these are the general parameters of what we would expect to find when dealing with the Roman battle dead, that they'll be on the battlefield and that they'll probably be located towards the areas of high casualties, just because why move the dead further than you need to if it's a practical thing. So there's no suggestion that the Roman battle dead are removed a huge distance to be buried or cremated. We'd be looking for a mass grave of some kind. So it's not individual grave cuts, it's mass one for all of the casualties. That we'd be looking in the earlier period, either inhumation or cremation, depending on circumstances. But then later on into the imperial period, we'd be looking for cremation more specifically, and that these wouldn't be marked with any permanent memorial or monument to the battle. So is that what we see in the archaeology? Well, these are pretty much all of the sites at the moment that are known that have conflict related remains that have been excavated, the majority coming from sort of the last 30 years since conflict archaeology has been a discipline, but some, particularly the siege sites in the Near East, in the Levant, they were excavated a little bit early in the 20th century, as were some of the sites in Europe. But all of the sites in orange are open field battle sites, and pretty much all of those have been discovered and excavated in the last 30 years. So where on those sites have we found human remains? Just these ones. So Kalkriese up in Germany, and then Dura-Europos down in Syria, which is a siege site that was excavated back in the 1930s. So it's not an example of modern excavation. These are not the only human remains related to Roman battle that are found, though. There are also 3 further battlefield-related graves that are found near Vienna in Austria, in Croatia, and then also at Valencia in Spain. So what do we see in these graves? Well, at Kalkriese, it's innately an unusual site, a wonderful site, but an unusual one, identified as being the site of a major Roman military disaster in AD 9, the so-called Varus disaster, or Battle of the Teutoburg, where the Romans lost 3 legions, or close to 3 legions, in a disastrous ambush attack by a Germanic tribal coalition. So this is a Roman defeat. So already we're not looking at the Romans controlling this battle site, but being subject to the enemy controlling the site in the aftermath of the conflict. So there's no one single mass grave here. There's a series of bone pits that contain the disarticulated remains of, I think, about 50 or so individuals. They were disarticulated before they went into the grave. So the human remains show evidence of having been exposed on the surface for between 2 and 10 years, which is consistent with what the historical sources tell us about the aftermath of the Varus battle, where the Roman dead were left exposed for 6 years before eventually being reburied when another Roman army returned to the site. So we have these pits, but these are not, this is potentially Roman work. Is it Roman work? The Roman sources suggest that it's one single burial that is created by the Roman army, whereas these are a number of, I think it's 8 or 9 pits that have been found. So that's not consistent with the historical sources. Is this actually a German led burial of some of the casualties? Maybe. At the moment, it's difficult to be certain, but so we're seeing, these remains not being treated in the way that we might expect, but it's probably difficult to do that at this point with them having been disarticulated for so long. Adding to the complexity at Kalkriese is a recent discovery in 2018 of a near complete set of Roman lorica segmentata armor, which you can see on the top right of this slide, that was discovered during metal detection work at the battlefield. Analysis of the armor has suggested that somebody was wearing it when it went into the ground. Perhaps it's an executed soldier that has been buried in his armor for whatever reason. Maybe he'd been lying on the surface for too long to get it off him. Practically, there are some lurid suggestions in the press that he was buried alive in his armor as a human sacrifice by those terrifying Germans, but I'm yet to be convinced by that. So, okay, so Calcarisa doesn't really match up with what we would expect. At Dura Europos, again, we're not looking at a conventional burial of battle dead, even though there should be thousands of them from this site. Instead, we're looking at another unusual deposit. So this site relates to a Sasanian siege of a Roman-held city. So Dura is a city that had swapped between Roman hands and Sasanian hands multiple times over the previous century, but comes to a head in AD 256 with a siege that will ultimately destroy the city, and it's never reoccupied afterwards. So the remains of at least 19 Roman soldiers and one Sasanian soldier were found in a collapsed counter-mine structure around Tower 19 on the city defenses, which you can see circled on this map with the red circle. And these soldiers were initially thought to have been killed in either a fire or in an attack, a fight in the mine itself. But subsequent reevaluation a few years ago showed that there was actually probably a chemical attack that had killed these soldiers. They'd been targeted with sulfuric acid being pumped into the mine, and that the dead or dying Roman soldiers were then dragged to another part of the mine, and it was collapsed on top of them. So there are these are the only human remains from the siege, as I say, despite there being potentially thousands of casualties from this. And they're still fully equipped. They've got their weapons, they've got their armor, they've got their money in their pouches. There's been no attempt to loot them whatsoever. They were literally just left where they died and never recovered. So again, not a conventional burial. In all of the excavations in the site, around the site, no other burials have been found associated with the siege, despite the fact that there must have been a lot. So that's it in terms of known conflict sites that have been excavated and remains have turned up as a result of those excavations. However, there are also several sites where remains have turned up during the course of other development activities, so commercial development particularly, that shed some other light on what happens to Roman soldiers after conflict. So one example is from Valencia in Spain. This is the one, if you have a weak stomach, maybe don't listen to parts of the description of what happens to these soldiers. So in Valencia, we have the remains of 14 male individuals who were excavated from beneath a destruction level, which is dated to the 1st century BC and cautiously identified with the Sertorian civil war in Spain during this period. All of the individuals are aged between 17 and 35. As analysis of their skeleton shows that they were heavily muscled, used to hard labor, and they had a diet consistent with the Roman military diet, which was discovered through isotope analysis. So they're Roman soldiers. They're not in good shape when they go into the ground and are piled under this destruction level. They've had their hands, their arms, and their legs cut off with heavy blows from bladed weapons. Several of the individuals are also decapitated before going into the ground. The excavators have suggested that the men were still alive while this happened, but that they were probably restrained at the time. So we're looking at prisoners that have been captured and then are being executed soon afterwards. One of the individuals has also been impaled with a spear, and you can see a lovely line illustration of the process by which this has happened. So again, I warned you ahead of time not to look if you were squeamish. So the suggestion is that these men had been captured restrained and then were tortured, that they'd been taken captive during the Battle of Valencia in 75 BC, and then had been executed as an example, and then were dumped in the city and fell underneath the destruction level. There's no attempt to lay out these remains. They have just been discarded. The only reason they're in such good condition as they are is because they were buried under this destruction level that was then not disturbed afterwards. So this is not again typical of what we might expect from the treatment of the battle dead. This was a recent discovery. It caused quite a sensation when it came out. This is a Roman mass grave from Vienna. It was found only in 2024, so this is one where research is ongoing. But during construction on a football pitch in a suburb of Vienna, this mass grave was discovered containing the remains of at least 129 male individuals, potentially up to 150 or so. But that's pending sort of further post-excavation work. Again, all the skeletons are male. They're aged about 20 to 30 years old. They're heavily muscled. They're used to hard labor. They also have the Roman military diet. They all have evidence of skeletal injury and trauma, particularly to their head, their torso, and their pelvis, inflicted both by sharp blade weapons and by blunt force blows. So most of these are perimortem. There's no sign of recovery, healing of the injuries. So these are wounds that they sustained at or around the time of their death. So the variety of their wounds suggests they're not executed, as the examples at Valencia were, but instead they're probably killed in a battle and then put in this mass grave. So this might actually be for the first time a burial that's actually on the battlefield, but until further work happens in the site around, this can't be verified. So that we know that there is a battle around this, around the time that the carbon dating puts them, so to around about AD 80 to 130, at which point we know that the Romans are campaigning in this region under the Emperor Domitian. So potentially this is a battle site that's related to that conflict, and these are the Roman battle dead. But without knowing the circumstances of the battle, we don't know whether these are soldiers who are buried by the Romans or by their enemies. But it's heavily chaotic. These bodies have not been laid out in organized fashion. They have just been thrown into this mass grave and then left unattended. There's and further burial of likely soldiers at Mursa, or modern Osijek, in Croatia. So these are 7 male skeletons who were excavated in 2011 during the construction of a university building, and they've been thrown down a well. So they've been dumped in head first. They've been stripped of armor and weapons and valuables, but they do have, again, signs of having been Roman soldiers. They're all male. They're all the right age profile. Again, isotope analysis confirms their diet. And some of them have long healed skeletal trauma and injuries, and some of them have perimortem injuries as well, including a punctured sternum, bladed weapon blows to the forearms, and then puncture wounds to their ribs and hips. So again, we know that there is a battle within the time frame that they've been carbon dated to. They've been cautiously identified with the Battle of Mursa, a battle that takes place during the so-called third century crisis of the Roman period. Again, we need to do excavations on this site to establish, is this part of a battlefield, or are these casualties who were taken prisoner and then executed and then thrown down a well a little bit later. But again, we're not seeing any kind of organized formal burial of these soldiers. They're just thrown down a pre-existing feature. So while these 3 examples are not fully established as being technically battlefield burials, but I think that they will probably all be confirmed as being such if additional work can continue, they do provide a bit more insight into the realities of how the battle dead are seen. That it's not, necessarily a solemn ceremony to dispose of the remains of either your own soldiers or the enemy who've given their lives in this honorable, quest for Roman glory, that actually in a lot of cases they've just been treated like rubbish to be thrown away as conveniently as possible. Nowhere have we seen the kind of treatment of the battle dead that would be expected from what we're told in the literary sources. It's all so much more casual, so much more practical, and it's just completely different to what would be expected. Adding to the confusion is this lovely site, the Tropaeum Traiani at the site of Avanclisi in Romania. So this is a battle site from the Dacian Wars, fought under the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century AD. And just after I told you at the start of this talk that the Romans don't mark battlefields with monuments, nor do they write the names of the dead on monuments, well, I have this site to prove me wrong in at least one instance. So this is a massive monument that's put up to the memory of both the conflict and the battle that took place on this site. Specifically, what you can see on the screen is a modern reconstruction based on the remains that were found at the site. It's decorated with panels showing scenes from the war, which you can see on the slide. And then in front of it is a massive stone altar onto which an inscription has been carved, which gives the names of about 3,800 Roman soldiers who died either in this battle at the site or in the Dacian Wars more widely. So this is unprecedented in the Roman world. We don't see any other comparable examples of this. Why it is decided that this battle gets this kind of memorial complex and the soldiers' names being listed is a complete mystery. Generally, Roman battlefield monuments are placed in cities, settlements, high passage roads, places where people are actually going to see them, both the Romans to confirm their glory and then the enemy to sort of be reminded that Rome is so much better and stronger than them. This site, this monument, is in the middle of nowhere. It's probably only ever going to be seen by the Roman soldiers that occupy the site and then the locals who live there. So it makes absolutely no sense as a monument, and yet it exists, and we have to kind of reconcile it and decide, is this just, you know, a one-off that was to make a political point, or is this an indication that this conflict was seen as something different compared to other conflicts of the time? But if this is the case, it takes us even further away from having any idea what the so-called routine treatment of the Roman battle dead actually was. So now what we see from the archaeology, okay, we're still seeing the mass disposal of remains. We're generally seeing more inhumation than cremation, though. At the sites that have been excavated, there is no evidence of cremation burial. There are no pits containing ashes. There are no areas of fire damage. There are no artifacts that have been damaged by exposure to fire. There's no obvious places that the cremations have been held. There's evidence that these are very hasty disposals, that they're done as quickly as possible. That if remains are somewhere inaccessible, so such as in a collapsed mine, no attempt will be made to recover them, that they will just be left there. The existing features may be used where appropriate. You can throw soldiers down a well if that suits your purposes at the time. And actually that we have more evidence at the moment in the archaeology for soldiers who are killed and who are captured and then killed after the battle than soldiers who were killed in kind of the main event. And we can say, despite Avanclisi, I think we can still say that they're probably not marked by any surface features. And so you'll have noticed then, what about the excavated battle sites that were on the map that don't have evidence of human remains? I'm not going to go through each one of those in turn, but I'm just going to look at the example of Baikala in Spain to illustrate how problematic it is in terms of where are the dead from this battle. So this is a battle from the Second Punic War. between the Carthaginians and the Romans. It's a large set-piece formal battle in the south of Spain, one of the few actual pitched battle sites that there is known archaeologically from the Roman world. They've excavated about 20% of the site, but it's been very comprehensively metal detection surveyed, and there has been work to kind of identify areas of cremation and burning, and nothing has been turned up so far. There's no evidence of a grave here. On the battlefield, in the hinterland around, they have looked, and there's no evidence of one. There should be one, though. There are thousands of casualties from this battle. There is no reason why there shouldn't be there, but there's no evidence of a grave cut. There's no evidence of clearing, of cremation. So what has happened to these casualties? And this is repeated at so many of the other Roman battle sites, of just where we would expect to find the Roman battle dead on the field or just outside the area of fighting. We just don't see them. So what is going on? So potential reasons that there could be that these graves haven't survived for natural cause reasons, that they were shallow burials on the surface and they've just, been exposed by natural causes, and those remains have been lost. It's possible. Shallow burials are frequently used on battlefields. The environmental conditions aren't conducive to the survival of these remains. Again, possibly, although I'd like to see some evidence of why in each specific case that is, would be true. Rather than just going, oh, well, they just haven't survived. There's too much of a tendency in Roman archaeology to just go, oh, well, it just haven't survived, but it was there originally. And I think that's a little bit lazy when we're talking about the burials of these battle dead, or indeed the animal activity has disturbed them, again, linked to them maybe being shallow burials. They haven't survived because of human action, that they were dug up by the enemy in antiquity, or they've been disturbed by sort of later land use in either antiquity, in the medieval period, and they've been cleared away. Again, fairly reasonable, you'd think, but why would the mass grave have been removed, but the rest of the battlefield is completely undisturbed? Again, we'd have to look on a site-by-site basis rather than just making that sweeping assertion. Or are they not cremated? Are they not created at all? Is burial and cremation actually something that doesn't happen as much as we would like to think, for reasons of time, for reasons of resources? And I know that's a controversial thing. I'm not necessarily saying that that's what the Romans do or don't do, but it's something we need to certainly think about, even if it's just to prove that, no, they do still bury their dead. So we do see in the ancient sources some support for some of these ideas, so that maybe human activity has impacted these burials. So we see in the instance of one battle site from the Roman Republican period, we hear that the shallow graves of the battle dead become exposed due to weather and kind of erosion, and that the local people use the bones to in agricultural activity, that they take the long bones from the battle site and they use them to put fences around their vineyards. So, human activity potentially removing these burials that had been created. So this is something that, okay, we are seeing maybe in antiquity happening. And so that's a possibility. The one that I want to talk about most, and sort of I'll finish up on, is whether these graves are sort of not created at all. Now, ostensibly, this should be a no. As far as we know, there are no reasons for the Romans to not bury their battle dead. And we're told by ancient sources, so this one is a military writer from the Roman period, Arnisander, tells us that the burial of the battle dead is a holy act of reverence towards the dead and a necessary example for the living. For if the dead are not buried, each soldier believes that no care will be taken of his own body should he chance to fall, observing what happens before his own eyes, and thereby judging of the future, feeling that he likewise, if he should die, would fail of burial. And so waxes indignant at the contemptuous neglect of burial. But does this suggest that if this writer is encouraging people to bury the dead because he said because it impacts the morale, does that suggest that in some circumstances people are tempted to not properly bury the dead? And there is an idea that that Roman soldiers wouldn't be willing to go to fight if they knew that their remains would lie unburied and despoiled after their death. And yet we see this being cautiously addressed in some of the sources as well. So one Roman writer, Cicero, when he's talking about being unburied in death, he says that if you are unburied and abandoned because you've fallen in warfare, if you've fallen for the sake of the fatherland, then this is not the same as being abandoned and unburied in any other circumstance, and that it's piteous for everybody else to be unburied and abandoned. But if you're a soldier who's fallen in warfare for Rome, then it's okay if you end up in that circumstance, and presumably you won't be, an unrestful ghost that will wander and haunt the world forever until you get a proper burial. So we are seeing maybe these slight indications that burial is not always universal. We do see references to the battle dead having to be buried later by friendly armies when they have just been left abandoned on sites. So during one of the Roman civil wars, we hear about the Roman commander Pompey coming across unburied bodies from a previous battle, and that he gives them an honorable and splendid burial years after they had fallen. And so, who knows how many remains have been lost in that period. They've lain on the surface for a significant period of time. Again, going back to the Calcresa site, and the Varus battle of AD 9, we hear about the burial of those soldiers, that the Roman army buried the bones of the 3 legions, whatever was left on the surface. No man knew whether he consigned to earth the remains of a stranger or a kinsman, but all thought of all as friends and members of one family. So again, we've got the battle dead being buried at a later period, and the only reason that can have happened is because they weren't buried originally. They recognize as well that sometimes you will have to have unusual circumstances if you are going to bury the dead. This final quote comes from the Hellenistic Greek period, but it's still useful to indicate that the ancients recognized that if the dead were unburied for a few days, that you wouldn't be able to do your usual circumstances. So the dead have laid unburied for 5 days on this battlefield, and as a result, it was not now possible to carry away the bodies. And so they essentially, they dig pits alongside them and just sort of push them in, which I know from talking to other archaeologists is seen in later periods of history as well, that this is kind of an emergency type of disposal because the battle dead haven't been buried straight away. So we are seeing indications that maybe that is happening. We see other instances where the Romans don't bury their dead during particularly difficult circumstances. So we hear in one battle about the lake being filled with the bodies of the battle dead, and that 200 years later, their remains are still emerging. So obviously they weren't recovered in the aftermath and given a dignified burial. After another defeat, we hear that the Romans, they have a grievous night and take no steps to bury their dead, nor to care for their wounded and dying. So it's again something that they don't necessarily do in emergency circumstances. And from a late battle in the kind of later Roman imperial period, again after a military disaster, we're told that some of the dead from this battle were buried in such manner as the present circumstances allowed. So what manner is that? I think it's glossing over that that's probably going to be quite a cursory burial, and that the bodies of the rest of the slain were devoured by the foul birds that are wont at such a time to feed on corpses, as is shown by the plains even now white with bones. So again, the battle dead just being left exposed, eaten by carrion birds, and no attempt made even to collect up those remains. So I'm hoping that what I've got across in this talk, I could go on for hours about this, and I'm happy to talk to people about this by email and things as well. But the disposal of the Roman battle dead is clearly a lot more complex than we realize, or that we're led to believe from the historical sources. That what we see being written in the sources in terms of the processes of burying the dead is not what we see on the battlefield. However, where they do match up is that a lot of the sources not mentioning what happens to the battle dead, and a lot of the battlefields archaeologically having no trace of the battle dead. So again, I want to reiterate, I'm not saying that Roman soldiers or that the Roman army just deliberately abandoned all of its battle dead on these battlefields, and that is definitely what's happened. But I'm saying that the picture of the treatment of the battle dead is much more complicated than we have perhaps realized in the past, and that conflict archaeology is demonstrating that actually all of the things that we thought we knew about what happened to the Roman battle dead, we actually don't know them, and they don't stand up in to scrutiny when we actually look at the reality of these sites. And so hopefully over the next sort of decade or two, this is an area of research that we can start moving forward on, start looking at what genuinely we can say about the disposal of the Roman battle dead. Hopefully it doesn't lead us to the conclusion that the Romans just abandoned the majority of them to shallow or surface burials, or just left them where they lay. But if it does, then that's a road that we have to follow to its conclusion. But as I say, hopefully it's not quite that grim. So thank you all so much for your attention. And I hope I haven't given people nightmares with all of these pictures of human remains. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo. What another wonderfully thought-provoking discussion. So you want to moderate your own questions? I see you've got a hand, and I'll let you.
Yeah, so Richard, go for it.
Hi, Jo, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yep. All good.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was a brilliant presentation. That was fascinating. I have one question, and then there was something that stuck out to me from the slides. The burial grave in Vienna, which I think you said there was 120 or something soldiers buried in that. That was such a small area for so many remains. And then I was thinking about the Spanish field. I presume the lines across the map were transects taken for resistivity or something, looking for the mass grave, were they?
Yeah.
It just occurred to me that the spacing for those, they may well have just missed a grave of that size, just because it's so compact. It's such a small feature for so many dead, and even, I mean, if you're talking about 1,000 burials, that's what, 9 or so of those pits. You could easily miss all of that if you just don't happen to get your transects in the right place. So that stuck out at me a little bit. But obviously, as you're saying, there's a good likelihood that they're not burying the dead in many of these cases, and the graves aren't there to find. I just want to know if you came across anything in the sources about the sort of pragmatic approach to the dead in terms of campaigning, because obviously the Roman army are campaigning in theatres outside of Roman territory quite frequently, and it stands to reason, it was certainly in my mind, that even if you are victorious on the battlefield, if there is a threat from a foe, you might not want to have your soldiers kicking around for a couple of days burying the dead when you might need to be on the march. And it may well be a matter of pragmatism. I mean, we've seen where the Roman armies are defeated, the dead aren't getting buried, obviously, because they're not there to bury themselves. But where the Romans are victorious, it may well be that pragmatism simply forces them to move on. I was just wondering if you come across anything in the sources that suggested that haste might be a reason for abandoning the dead in some instances.
So they don't. It's a completely valid point, and I completely agree that this is partly what's happening. So there's not any sort of overt reference to this in any of the sources, but there are two things that are sort of relevant to it. So generally, when they're talking about campaigning, they do tend to move on after a battle, either the day after, or in exceptional circumstances, the day after that. So we're looking at sort of 12 to 36 hours on a battlefield at most, in most circumstances. So in that time, if you're imagining recovering from battle, treating the wounded, collecting looting the battlefield, all of that stuff, it really doesn't leave you a lot of time to bury the dead. And so I think that is a big part of it, that possibly detachments are left behind to do that, but again, they would be incredibly vulnerable if you're in unfriendly territory. So I think that probably does lead to a very pragmatic approach to this, of going, let's just get them, as shallow buried as possible. But the quicker you leave, the shallower it is, the more vulnerable that's going to be to being despoiled. But yeah, they move on incredibly quickly. There is a reference in Caesar when he's talking about his campaigns in Gaul, where he makes a big thing about how he hangs on for 3 days after a battle so that he can make sure the dead are buried, which suggests that 3 days is what is needed to potentially to bury the dead. So when the soldiers are moving on the day after the battle, there probably isn't enough time. And yeah, I do think that is potentially a factor in what we're seeing, in that they just can't wait around for long enough to do it. Now, whether locals then go on and do it, maybe they pay some locals to do it. I know in later history that does happen, but yeah, I think that the logistics of campaigning, particularly in unfriendly territory, do play a big role in how they choose to dispose of the dead.
In terms of locals burying the dead, there's also that factor that if you take out the spiritual and sort of the ritualistic elements of dead burial, the main reason for doing it is simply to avoid disease and contamination of water supplies and things like that. So if these battlefields are taking place in areas away from significant settlements, they may well have no reason to be buried by anybody else other than their comrades. And if their comrades are moving on in less than the 36 hours that Caesar cites, then yeah, it's entirely probable that they would just be leaving them behind. I just wondered if there was, you mentioned the one about Pompey. Do we know roughly where that, where Pompey stumbles across the remains of Roman soldiers during the Mithridatic Wars? Do we know roughly where that took place? Is it mentioned in the source?
We know the nearest town, but closer than that, no. So it could be a mile from the town. It could be 20 miles from the town. It's Roman sources are not specific with this. They just say the nearest settlement. So
that's fair enough.
Yeah, so it's not enough. And I mean, it would be great to sort of go and look at those sites, but a lot of those kind of Civil War ones are in Greece, and the Greek authorities are not big at the moment on us coming and digging up their battle sites. They're quite happy with how their history is at the moment, and they don't want to change. So
politics always gets in the way of good archaeology. Thank you, Joe. That's great. Thanks.
I've obviously put everybody else off with grim stuff, the battle dead. Oh, yes, Dan.
Yeah, I got one question. If the Romans won a battle, okay, would they have taken captured enemy and used them as slave labor to bury the dead?
That is it depends on the circumstances of the battle. So if it is somewhere where they feel they can take slaves, so if they feel that they're in roughly safe territory, so if it's sort of an invasion into their territory and then they've defeated the army and they can take them as slaves, so maybe. But a lot of the time they will avoid making warriors slaves, because then you have to detach loads of your soldiers to guard them. So if they're campaigning in hostile territory and somewhere where they feel quite militarily exposed, they will generally avoid taking slaves, just because it takes so much of your manpower to guard them, that you become a much less effective force in the field. So yeah, again, the slave labor thing could work. Certainly if it's sort of an incursion into their territory, but I'm not certain it would work sort of in hostile territory. But again, it's a possibility.
Well done. Very well done.
Quite a lot to think about. As always with these talks, I love that you guys always bring up other topics and thoughts and things that tend to get overlooked in the literature. So, and it's nice you're kind of talking about a landscape, and next talk will be Helen's talk about the landscape and the dead, or battles. So very interesting.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to Helen. It's going to be good.
Worked out well. So any other questions? Well, if not, you can always track down Joe's contact information on our website. and shoot her some more personal emails. But I guess I will end it here and say thank you all for joining us. And again, my apologies. I'm in a different time zone. We did daylight savings. I didn't realize you guys hadn't done it yet. Multiple things going on here with time zones. So next month, we'll be back to normal. Our talk will be 3:30 US East Coast time. I'm going to let you guys figure out what time that is on your end. But hopefully you will all join us for our next lecture. And thank you very much, Joe, for another very thought-provoking lecture. So thank you guys.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Bye.